All right, and we are back for our first conversation for this morning. And we have an interesting conversation. We have two wonderful guests, in studios with us who are committed to fixing the world and some of the issues we face in our societies. We have Elisa Castellanos, who is Director of Tikkun Olam Belize, as well as Miss Christy Almeida, who is the Director of Autism Belize. Both no strangers to our morning show. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
And so, first of all, I'd like to kind of get an understanding for those of our viewers who may not be aware of what it is that both your organizations do separately, and then talk a bit about how your purpose and your visions cross paths. So we start with Ms. Castellanos.
So Tikkun Olam Belize is a small organization, and it's a bit controversial, so I don't want to, but it's, we do sex worker rights and anti-human trafficking, and we take on domestic violence or violence against women in particular. We're based in Orange Walk, and we are very much interested in partnering with police to sensitize police and to share with them what it's like for us as sex workers and women who experience domestic violence going into the police department and making that report, and how important it is in how that interaction is and that repertoire is built on.
Interesting. And Miss Chrissy?
Hi. Okay, so Autism Belize is also a very small organization. We focus on teaching about autism and other neurodiversities. We promote awareness, and we provide support for parents, and we're just there really to help try and support these families with special education needs, children, teenagers, young adults.
So how is it that your organizations have crossed paths?
Honestly, I think all of us individually as CSOs have reached out to the police at time and again asking to assist with training, sensitization. And I have to give credit to the Ministry of Home Affairs and the police department, because this time they reached out. Their CEO wrote a concept paper to talk about how we can start building capacity. And he used the word, and I loved it, he said, light a spark, an interest with the police department to work with organizations like ourselves to assist with vulnerable populations. I think the idea is, how do they recognize who these vulnerable populations are? How do they interact and respond when there are issues? And then how can we work together to manage the risks for these populations?
Miss Kirsty, I wanna take it over to your side, because I was particularly intrigued with your work as it relates to sex workers. I want to talk about the legality of sex work in Belize, just so we can know, or just so our viewers would know how the Belize Police Department can be beneficial to these persons.
The law really isn't clear or very specific. It really just speaks to criminalizing the demand or the purchasing of sexual services. And when we see sexual services, it's a variety. It could be from just companionship, escorting, all the way to the full deed. And there's a moral perspective that comes along with that. And a lot of times when sex workers go to the police department and, they're experiencing domestic violence as well, they go to the police department and they don't get the support that they need to be able to carry these cases through. And then what you have is that they'll either fight it on their own, they're trying to navigate the court system, because a lot of times children are involved. And it's at the police department, that point of contact is so important when we're talking about sexual assault, when we're talking about domestic violence. It's very important that police have an understanding that people are traumatized, and you might be dealing with a victim that is very traumatized from their experience with domestic violence, and it depends on how they're received, whether or not that person has the inner strength and courage and security to proceed with the justice system to try to fight domestic violence. And each case that we receive as a police department, and each victim that we assist builds confidence in the system and also sheds light on domestic violence and the social stigma of it, and to report and step forward decreases. And so that's why it's so important that police are sensitized and understand. But when it comes to the law, sex work itself, it's not very clear. And like I said, there is no explicit illegality in selling the sex services, but there is the criminality of buying sexual
purchasing.
services.
So do you think
or
that,
soliciting for sexual services.
so do you think that not having that clear distinction is what would maybe hinder police officers from providing the support to these workers?
It offers no protection. There's no explicit protection. There's no ability for sex workers to unionize. There's no. It's very high risk. It's a very high risk job to be doing, and there's no open, clear distinction of where sex workers are when it comes to the legality of things. If a sex worker suffers violence from not an from a person that takes their money back after they've given the services, there's really no place in the legal system for a report of that nature. And because they're sex workers, a lot of times there's discrimination and stigma that's attached to that, as there is to mental health issues. A lot of people don't want to, but it's also connected, because really when you talk about sex workers, we are really just women, sisters, mothers, aunts, friends who are also having issues with mental health, and that is also a very necessary part of this whole initiative.
I think it's worthy to note that an individual facing a violent occurrence is simply that, an individual facing a violent act or is a victim of a violent act, despite their occupation, whether formal or informal, despite your mental health or even your physical well-being. And at the end of the day, it is my view that the police is there to offer a service, which is to protect and serve. And I've seen cases, I know of cases where individuals that are clearly struggling with their mental health, but they've also been encountered individuals that have either physically abused them or verbally threatened them, and they go to the police to make an official complaint, and it's almost in some cases as if it's a joke, as if can you speak clearly, or are you in the right mindset to say exactly what happened? Did that really happen to you? And so questions at first that doubts the person that's the victim's report, and as a result diminishing the individual and perhaps causing the individual to question whether themselves as to whether or not this really happened to them. And I would imagine that's a huge issue.
We see it even within the school system, and especially with our kids with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, When they are asked for something, if there's something that's reported, do they have the capacity to speak intelligently and answer these questions? If they are hearing impaired, is there someone there that, will know sign language? Are there advocates there to speak to them? And this isn't to excuse the police at all, but you don't know what you don't know.
I agree.
And for many years, maybe that's been the part that they don't understand this. We've seen the cases. We've seen the young man by the swing bridge. We've heard about cases of things that happen in the actual police department. And this isn't unique to Belize. You search, last night I did it, police and autism, and you would not believe the amount of stuff about, this autistic that was tased or da-da-da. It's across the world, this is an issue, but police don't know. And so today is about really trying to start this conversation. This isn't going to solve the problem at all. This needs to be quite simply a start, a good start, but a start. And then hopefully what will continue are more of these things, or the development of an actual training module that the police academy can have that will address mental health, physical disabilities, individual disabilities, you know, sex workers, domestic violence, LGBTQIA issues, all of them, vulnerable populations, the elderly. How do you interact with them? How do you respond? What are the tools that the police need, the resources that they need? If they get someone who is nonverbal, who can they call to help this person communicate? That sort of thing. And the good thing is, and I questioned it at first when the police reached out, is that we're actually speaking to senior management. It's the commissioners to the superintendents countrywide that they're bringing together today. And at first I'm like, well, I want the guy that's on the ground, that's going to be on the street when, or somebody that I call when I say my son has eloped and they don't understand what that means. I wanted that. But I recognize what CEO Arthurs is trying to do. He's trying to get that buy-in, that understanding from the top, then hopefully this will trickle down and everyone else can see. I mean, if I had my wish, every single officer from the commissioner right on down would have to do a certain amount of training to work with vulnerable populations.
So how or where does this conversation start? As I understand, when you say it's going to be a lengthy process, especially shifting our perspectives on what it means to be empathetic, to be understanding of vulnerable populations. But where does the conversation begin?
I think the empathy. Right now, today, UNIBAM will be presenting Mental Health Association, BAPTA, Belize Assembly for Persons with Diverse Abilities, along with ourselves. There's not enough time. There's no way we're going to teach everything that needs to be taught. But if at the end of today we've got their attention, if they start to feel empathetic to the struggles of these vulnerable populations, if they start to realize that there's more they can do when interacting with these vulnerable populations, I think that's an excellent foundation of where to start.
Mrs. Stella, I want to take the conversation back over to you. For the benefit of our viewers as well, how do you sensitize police officers in being able to distinguish the difference between voluntary sex workers and potential human trafficking victims or human trafficking victims?
I love your question because it really and truly, for me, when it ties into how do we start this conversation. And I think first we got to talk about building systems of care that are trauma informed. When police officers, one, can see, we can have an understanding that even police officers, these are people who are underpaid, overworked. They also have trauma, personal trauma that they come into the job with. They experience traumatic events on the job, and a lot of times there's no structure that provides support. So we want to start the conversation by let's talk about trauma and becoming or building a more collective mindfulness and self-awareness. Sorry, I'm talking with my hands.
No, okay.
Building a mindfulness and self-awareness that will build empathetic feeling and consensus with the police department to be able to speak on from a human level, a humane level, to the victim, you know, and to come from an understanding, how do we, because if we don't deal with our own traumas, you can't pour from an empty cup, as they say. So if we don't build from our own traumas, if we are service providers, whether that be law enforcement or it be at the health services, the hospital, if we aren't informed about trauma and how it affects people, then as a police officer, trauma affects memory. It changes the brain literally. There are aspects of the brain that change with children that have adverse childhood experiences. There are types of trauma. If we don't educate our police on how it affects police, the ability to do a prosecution focused policing method, then, you know, we really and truly are not really making progress fighting domestic violence or any form of violence against women and other vulnerable populations.
How did you get connected or involved in advocating for sex workers?
I started all the way back in 2004 doing HIV prevention, and I realized that the programs are very focused on here's a condom, but they didn't look at issues like why is it that sex workers will take a risk of not using a condom with clients, and it's because they don't have that extra $100 would go a long way when I have 3 kids to feed at home, and the family court is the process for receiving the payments. One, the law, it's very low. The amount of required by law for a father to provide for his children is very low. It doesn't match with the standard of living that we're currently experiencing. And so you have women left with, these are women that might not have a lot of education, that don't have, that are traumatized. They have generational trauma. There's a lot of sexual trauma in the community. People are sexually assaulted by their uncle, by their friend, and then on top they go into sex work, and a lot of times they have to deal with the trauma of the machismo and the femicide, the risk of femicide in Belize. So really and truly, it's this experience, really, this initiative looks at how do we work within where we are with the law, but still providing service to these vulnerable women, because it's not only them, these are mothers and they have children. And so sex workers are at risk because, like I said, they will take that extra $100 and take a risk, get into this vehicle with this stranger, go somewhere with a stranger, and because they need that extra money. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on education for women, opening spaces where women can voice their opinions, and really, hopefully for us, the ideal as an NGO is to, in an eventual future, where Belize is this state where we're open-minded, we're connected with our emotional and spiritual awareness as human beings, or with our humanity, and we can accept people and their realities, even though if we don't agree with the way that they live their lives, but we have that respect.
So you initially learned of the situation of sex workers because of your work with HIV victims,
Yes,
you
ma'am.
said. Was this something that these persons would interact with you and tell you their plight?
Yes, I started visiting the bars at that time, way back in the day. It was Rose Garden, was a very popular spot. But I come from Orange Walk, where, just in the last study that we did as an NGO, out there, looking at all the bars and brothels that are out there, we counted about 25 just in just the town area of Orange Walk. So it's really kind of like the headquarters. There's a lot of sex work that happens in Orange Walk, and it's pretty kind of like an open secret. And so I started there, visiting these bars, educating women about, using the condom, how to protect yourself against STDs, and then STIs and STDs, and it just kind of progressed over the years into understanding that sex workers, that label shouldn't block me as an activist from understanding that there are other human issues that these women are experiencing and deserve every right. And then later on, I kind of had a personal experience with sex work and came out of it instead of with shame and the feeling of being indecent or dirty, came out feeling very empowered. But when analyzing that as an activist, I saw a lot of privilege. I have a higher education than a lot of the women are able to do. And then we have migrant women that come in, and so really and truly there's a variety of factors, but that's how I got started and realized that it doesn't matter how we label people. We're all humans, and we're all just really trying not to suffer on this experience. And so it's important, and over the years it's just been so beautiful to see different people come on board. And we realize that it's working together and working unifying our responses. And it's not just, so I'm over here in my corner fighting sex worker rights, but sex workers are women that have children with autism, women that need mental health support. So it's all interconnected.
Just to go back to the conversation with the police department, I understand that having the conversation is the start, but we must understand, you all must understand that this is an uphill battle that we're fighting here. We're talking about a system or a department or a force that are set in their ways and have been set in their ways for decades. I mean, you talk about trauma. police officers face trauma on the job almost every day. You talk about overworked police officers who then have to come in contact after maybe a 6-7 hour shift with someone who's a sex worker making a complaint, or someone with mental illness making a complaint, and that adds to the already overworked officers. So on one hand, you have the conversations happening, but there's also a need for a systemic change in the way our police officers are treated and in the type of workload that they have, wouldn't you say?
We had this conversation while we were waiting to come on, and I think a lot of times people spend in a boardroom or a conference room and they're having these really high-level intellectual conversations. And I sit in some of them. And sometimes it frustrates me because I hear word soup, and then I hear talk about the problem, but there's no action.
Yeah.
Then there are NGOs. We're on the street. We're talking to, she's out there in the bars talking to the ladies. I have the parents calling me all the time. We are on the ground trying to do things. I think neither approach is necessarily wrong, but if we both can work more closely together, we might be able to get more significant change. For me as an NGO, I know I'm not reaching everyone. I know I can't do everything. We're really small, we're parent-led, but we're doing something. We're making a little difference. We did a training this week and there were 80 people there. That's 80 more that understand a little bit more about something else. You know, that's how it works. So if we could join together as we are here, I think we look at it from all angles. Start building capacity and the empathy, talk about how we develop and establish training, and then use some of these same things to work on how do we look at the police department on a whole. And, and I'll tell you, these issues are around. I used to work with the police department.
There you go.
Probably before you were born, but I was there. I know. I can remember hearing some of the stories. I remember during a hurricane how many of them were out in wading through water because Belize was under for weeks, and none of them had raincoats or umbrellas at the time, and how many got sick after that. You know, I remember their stories. I get this, but we have to start somewhere. Right? And the idea is you just don't start and say, oh, well, this is great, and move on. In fact, when we talked about this and going to the media, all the NGOs, we said, as long as we have the assurance that this isn't the start and the end of this conversation.
There you go.
And that's the commitment that we got from the Ministry of Home Affairs, that this is a start and that we will continue. Because we said we weren't going to go on the media, we weren't going to do this and waste our time if today was all it was going to be. And they said no. They recognize that there's more need and that we will have to continue this. So we'll keep the pressure on.
You know, the beauty about this for me, the buy-in for me, because I've always been, you know, I mean, I'm sure that the public knows me from many run-ins with government. You know, like, I've tried the approach where I'm there with spade and machete in my hand against government, like saying, you're doing this, you're making a crappy decision with this case, you're not doing it right, blah, 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 blah. And I tried chopping down the door, and now it's about really, I understand that police officers, just as I'm saying, oh, sex workers are people too, LGBT are people too, people with mental health issues are, we're human too. Police officers are human too. And they have childhood trauma, they have trauma from the job, and, you know, I think that we're not with, a lot of times police officers aren't as appreciated. You know, they're doing a tough job dealing with a lot of tough and ugly issues of society, and a lot of times, you know, in my personal opinion, I think that the police are underpaid. They should be paid more for the work that they're doing and have the resources to do the job right, and have the resources to learn and grow and be more mindful, so that one, they are better as people, so that they can better protect and serve as a system.
So you've gone from chopping down the door to
now-
building a door that's more accessible.
Yes, you know, and try to, it's just lighting a spark, and no big fire can't start without a spark. And this
Yeah.
is that starting, and it won't happen fast, but it's happening. And, you know, as an activist, I've learned to celebrate the little wins.
I
Yeah,
agree.
the little ones.
And I'm really, I really applaud this ministry for really reaching out and saying, okay, you know, hey NGOs, I know that we've always been on different ends, kind of like ready to come food down, but truce, you know, and let's figure out. And I think that this is the only way forward. When NGOs come in and have some measure of influence on how things go about getting done, but you know, it's a fine line measuring how do we do tough policing to fight crime, and where is there space for humanizing that approach?
So I want to repeat the different NGOs and vulnerable communities coming together to sensitize the police officers.
UNIBAM, Mental Health Association, BAPTA, Belize Assembly for Persons with Disabilities, Autism Belize, and
Tikunolam, Belize.
And
I'm
that
gonna mess up pronunciation.
that conversation is happening today.
Today.
Yes.
Today. All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for joining us this morning and having this very important conversation. I'm sure this is not the last we'll hear of this, and we look forward to some progress and some updates. I'm really encouraged by this conversation and the initiative that is taking place here.
All right,
Thank you for
we
having
are
us.
going to take a break, and when we come back, it's all about the Cancer Society fashion show. Don't go away.